I want to introduce our first speaker, Dominic LaMantia. He's a PhD student at the University of Notre Dame. His dissertation focuses on the formal distinction in Scotus and what comes to be called the virtual distinction in Aquinas. He also has an interest in post medieval scholasticism and philosophy of religion. His paper this morning is entitled Aquinas on the Distinction in Ratio.
Okay, hello, everybody. Yes, I'm going to be talking about the distinction in ratio today. This is a kind of distinction that Aquinas invokes between the divine attributes and the metaphysical grades of the Porphyrian tree, so rationality and animality in Socrates. And I don't have enough time to do it. And so I thought, well, I could either talk inadequately about one view or I could talk very inadequately about four different views. And so I'm going to do that. So I'm going to give a kind of lay of the land of some of the medieval disputes on this because I think there are basically four families of views in the scholastic tradition. I'm going to race through three of them and then talk about Aquinas at the end. So one way to introduce this is via an inconsistent triad, which is on the handout that's coming out. One thing that's interesting about this inconsistent triad is that there's sort of a contemporary version of the inconsistent triad, and many of the moves that are made by the scholastics or moves they would make to resolve this inconsistent triad, they're very closely analogous moves that people in contemporary analytic philosophy make to resolve this other inconsistent triad. That said, I'm going to not talk about the analytics anymore. So here's the inconsistent triad. God's will is such that he wills by it, and God's intellect is not such that he wills by it. God's will is God's intellect. And then if A and B are identical, then if A is F, B is F. Okay? Inconsistent triad. The first premise can be derived via an enthymematic argument. God wills by his will. God does not will by his intellect. Therefore, God's will is such that he wills by it, and God's intellect is not such that he wills by it. Okay. Where do we go from here? Well, as I say, there are four different families of views that I found in the scholastic period. The first two, they are semantic solutions. So they rely on semantics to do the heavy lifting for their to escape this inconsistent triad. Most of these people are nominalists, and what they rely on is their theory of connotation. So medieval nominalists think that there are terms that signify something, and then they have a secondary signification that's called a connotation. So you can see Occam in quote one here. A connotative name is that which signifies something primarily and something else secondarily. So the idea is that a term will signify and refer to one object, but it will call something else to mind, and that's the connotation. So Rimini, Gregory of Rimini, gives an example of this in the second quote here. He says, "Mercy and justice in no way signify distinct things or entities in God, but only the same essence of God. Nevertheless, both of these connote something beyond the essence, or give a further understanding. As justice connotes the merits of a creature and the effect of God concerning those merits, wherefrom is the distribution of prizes and punishments. Similarly, mercy gives an understanding of miserable creatures and of the liberation of God who frees them from misery." Okay? These terms, justice and mercy, both just refer to the same thing. They refer to God's justice and God's mercy and God's justice. Both just refer to God, but they have distinct connotations. Okay? How so now there are two groups about how you employ these connotations. So one is a group I call the hardliners, and the hardliners are people like Adam Wodum, Gregory of Rimini, Pierre Dailly, Rodrigo Arriaga, and Thaisro Gonzalez, who we're celebrating his 400th birthday this year. So Thaisro Gonzalez at 400. And so they think so what they do is they would deny and explicitly deny 5 star. God does not will by his intellect. God does will by his intellect. Now, why? Because his intellect just is his will. Similarly, God punishes by his mercy, and he forgives sins by his justice. Why? Because they're just the same thing. These all sound like they're false, but that's only because the connotation isn't aligned. But strictly speaking, they're true. So you can see in quote 3, Adam Wodum, by deity itself, God understands and wills, and he understands by will and wills by intellect. Here's Rimini. Just as it is true to say that the divine intellect understands, thus it is true that his will understands. And just as his will wills, so too his intellect wills. Okay, so that's the hardliner strategy. Second strategy is a group I'm calling the Alchemists, and this involves William Ockham, Gabriel Biel, Saint Bonaventure, interestingly, and they differ from the hardliners because they think the connotation of a term actually enters into the truth conditions for propositions that involve it. So you can see quote 4 from Occam here. Some terms can mean the same thing principally and connote distinct things, because of which distinct connotations something can be truly predicated of one and truly denied of the other. That's him denying three. Okay, and here he goes. God is not said to understand through his will. So he thinks and Bonaventure and Beale think that the connotations of terms actually enter into the truth condition. So it's going to be false that God does not will by his intellect. Or sorry, it's going to be true that God does not will by his intellect. And that's the reason for it is semantic, though. Now, and Occam also says, look, if we like instituted a new term or we like got rid of the connotation, then he'd take the same approach as the hardliners. But in fact, our terms do connote what they connote. So that's how it goes, and that's what he says. He says something. Yeah, here's a bunch of quotes about that. Okay, third group is the Scotists, and in this I include Scotus himself, some like proto-Scotists like Peter John Olevi, and then John of Ripa, and the later Scotist tradition. So the Scotists they also deny three in the inconsistent triad, but they do it via a metaphysical story, not a semantic story. So and they do it through the form Scotus's famous formal distinction. So quote 6, therefore there is a distinction preceding the intellect in every way, and it is this, that wisdom is in the thing ex natura rei, and goodness is in the thing ex natura rei, but wisdom in the thing is not formally goodness in the thing. So Scotus think, look, there's a formal distinction between God's will and God's intellect, and because of the formal distinction, something can be truly predicated of one, which is denied of the other. And there's a complicated story about how that all works and what's going on there, but we're going to leave that aside for Scotus for another 40 years, and we can have Scotus at 700. So that's the basic story. Okay, now Aquinas. The broadly Thomistic camp, which I'm going to argue includes Aquinas, Henry of Ghent, and then some of the Thomists like Thomas of Sutton and Suarez. Of course, not all of these people are strictly speaking Thomists, but on this issue, they're in the broad family of Thomistic solutions. And I think so. Aquinas also denies three, but he doesn't do it with a semantic story. He doesn't really do it with a metaphysical story a little bit, but he puts a lot of weight on his cognitional theory to deny three. And he denies it by saying that there's multiple rationes in God. In this, he agrees with Scotus and disagrees with the hardliners and alchemists. In fact, the hardliners and alchemists critique Aquinas' God for being too complicated because there are multiple rationes in it. They think there's just one ratio in God. But Aquinas wants to say there's multiple. So what is for a ratio to be present in reality? You can see in quote 7, Aquinas says, a ratio is said to be in reality insofar as there is something in reality beyond the soul which corresponds to the conception of the soul, as the thing signified corresponds to the sign. For that which the intellect conceives is a similitude of the thing existing outside the soul. Okay, so the idea is look, there are ratios like in the mind. Those are like concepts or definitions or quantitative concepts we have of things. But a ratio can said to be in reality insofar as there's something corresponding to it, a similitude of the concept in the mind, a similitude in the world of it. Okay. This is important because this is a bit of a controversial point here, but for Aquinas, all knowledge, all cognition is partly grounded in similitudines. So he says there's quotes about this all over his corpus. So here's two of them from in quotations 8 here. All knowledge is brought about by a similitude of a thing known being present in the knower. What is understood is not in the intellect according to itself, but according to its similitude. So, over and over again, he talks about how there needs to be a similitude of the thing known to be cognized. In other words, a thing is cognized only insofar as the concept is a similitude of the thing cognized. Further, Aquinas thinks reference and names. Names refer and signify via concepts. Um, so this is Aquinas disagrees with Scotus and Occam and friends here because they think terms just refer directly to objects, but Aquinas thinks terms refer via the mediation of concepts. And so here's quote 9. Here's a representative quote for this. It should be said that according to the philosopher, words are signs of understandings, and understandings are similitudes of things, and thus it is clear that words are referred to the things signified by the mediating conception of the understanding. Therefore, according to which something can be cognized by our intellect, it can thus be named by us. Okay, so here's what I want to say. We name things insofar as we cognize them, and we cognize them insofar as there's a similitude. So we name them insofar as there's a similitude. Now, here's the other thing. We have distinct similitudines in the mind of the one divine perfection. There's no contra scotus, there's no distinction in God ex natura rei between the various divine attributes, but nevertheless, we do have distinct concepts which are distinct similitudes of the one divine perfection. And because they're distinct similitudes, they're distinct cognitions and distinct reference, I think. So let's look here at quote 10 here. Since God is in every way perfect according to one and the same reality, by one conception, our intellect cannot integrally apprehend his perfection. And as a consequence, neither can our intellect name his perfection integrally. And thus it is necessary that our intellect has diverse conceptions of it, which are the diverse rationes. And it is necessary that our intellect imposes diverse names signifying those rationes, whence those names are not synonyms insofar as they signify diverse rationes. Okay, so we can't fully comprehend, we can't fully grasp and cognize God in his entire perfection. God's perfection is too much for our intellects to grasp. And so instead, we grasp him now by one similitude, now by another. So, quote 11 here. If our intellect were to see God through himself, it could impose one name on that ratio. And thus, the last chapter of the book of Zechariah, verse 9, says that on that day the Lord will be one and his name will be one. But that one name would not signify his goodness alone, nor his wisdom alone, or something of this kind, but it would include the things signified by all of them. So, at least in this vale of tears, what do our terms, goodness and wisdom, do? They signify God's goodness alone and God's wisdom alone, right? Now, and why is that? Well, it's because they're diverse similitudines. We can only cognize insofar as they're similar to God, and we can only refer to them insofar as they're similar to God. So, even though God is one and simple, because he has diverse similarity relations to creatures, we can actually cognize one aspect or part or mm, yeah, it's not really good words to put it. One sort of portion of God's whole perfection, which is really one. Our intellect cognizing now one part of it, now another, with via our different concepts and via our different terms. And Aquinas gives one sort of explanation about how this takes place. I don't know how much of an explanation it is, but he says something like this in De Ante as well. So this is the long quote 12 here. The word body can be taken in many ways. Body, according as it is in the genus substance, is so called from the fact that it has a nature such that three dimensions can be designated in it. Now it happens in things that what has one perfection may also attain to further perfection. This is clear, for example, in man, who has a sensitive nature and further an intellectual nature. Similarly, another perfection, such as life or some other such perfection, can be added to the perfection of having a form, such that three dimensions can be designated in it. The word body, therefore, can signify some real thing which has a form from which follows the possibility of designating it in three dimensions, and signify this with precision, that is, in such a way that no further perfection may follow from that form, in a way such that if anything be added, it is outside the signification of body. The word body can also be taken in another way, namely to signify a thing which has a form such that the three dimensions can be designated in it, no matter what sort of form it is, whether some further perfection can come from it or not. Okay, so there are two ways to take body here. One is what's body signifying? Well, it's signifying all the bodily things as a whole. So Socrates, Brunellus, doesn't matter what sort of form they have, doesn't matter what sort of species, signifies all the bodily things. But there's another way of that body can signify, and that's with precision. And when it's signifying with precision, it doesn't signify the whole, that is Socrates or Brunellus. It signifies the perfection of having three dimensions, of possibly being three dimensional, with precision. That is, without any further perfections added on. It refers to the perfection of bodiliness as such. All right. This is, he goes on, same thing, we can do the same thing with animal. And such likewise is the relation of animal to man. For if animal were to name only that thing which has a perfection, such that it can sense and be moved by a principle within itself, and name this thing with the precision of another perfection, then any further perfection would be related to animal as a part, and not as implicitly contained in the notion of animal. Okay. So animal, in one way, can signify for all of the animals. In another way, it can signify the perfection of the sensitive perfection as such, without the rational perfection, without the abundance of daring that a lion has, without all of the different perfections that the various species add on to animality. Just animality as such is being signified. And I think something similar here is going on with regards to the divine attributes, our concepts and terms of the divine attributes. They can signify merely the perfection of God's goodness as such, without the perfection of God's wisdom, prescinding from any further perfection that can be added to it, even though they're really the same thing in God. And that's because God's really great and our concepts are kind of sucky. Okay. Now, you might not be asking, okay, well, what is the thing that's being cognized then? There's only one thing there to cognize. So what is it? What is this goodness alone? Where is that? That's a good question. I think there are two different things that one can say about this. One thing we could, and this is me trying to draw out Aquinas' view here about how we could explain it, right? So one is we could say, well, what is divine wisdom? What is divine wisdom alone? It's something that's identical to God's simple perfection, right? But it prescinds from the other perfections. So there's only one thing there. They're all identical, but there's this divine wisdom and it prescinds from the others. It's identical to God's whole perfection, but is in some sense distinct from it, distinct in ratio, right? Another way we could think about it is, what is this thing that we're cognizing? Well, it's God's entire simple perfection, qua similar to our concept of wisdom. Okay. And that qua here is going to have to be a reduplicate, a specificative qua, not a reduplicative qua for the qua experts in the room. But in the end, I think we get a picture, kind of like this little drawing I have on the handout here, where for the hardliners and for the alchemists, we have all these different terms and concepts. They all just pick out the one blob, which is God's entire perfection as a whole. That's it. That's all you can do. For Scotus, there are these lines. There are ex natura rei distinctions in God, despite a real identity. And so, of course, there are just distinct things there. So, of course, we can refer to them and think about them separately. For Aquinas, we have these little dotted lines because they're kind of there, they're kind of not. This distinction is partly grounded in God's perfection, partly grounded in our sucky concepts. Without our sucky concepts, it wouldn't be there. It's just one God in his simple perfection. But because of our the diverse similitudines he has to our concepts, we can pick out one part of God and now another. And this, I think, is what's going on when Aquinas gives explicit denials of three from our inconsistent triad. So there are a bunch of examples of this. Here are two, in quote 13. As the philosopher says, nothing prevents contradictories being predicated of that which is the same thing, differing only by ratio. Again, a contradiction of ratio suffices also for affirmation and negation of the same, since any distinction, as was said, includes an affirmation and negation. So that's the story. I think Aquinas would also deny three in our inconsistent triad, but he'd do it via this cognitional story rather than the metaphysical or semantic story that are given by the other three camps. All right, thank you.
So we have about 10 minutes for questions. I'll let Dominic call his own questions.
Michael.
Thank you very much. Just make it clear for me why, and this is not meant to be a reductio here.
Yeah.
Why how is Aquinas' position different from Occam's on this? So Aquinas's cognitive theory is driving it for Occam's semantic theory, but like they don't seem as different to me as I feel like I'm supposed to think they are.
Yeah. The difference, I think, is that for Occam, we're cognizing God's entire perfection whenever we cognize God, because that's the only thing there to cognize. But Aquinas is like, look, God's too perfect. We can't have one concept that grasps his entire perfection. So what are we grasping? We're grasping wisdom alone. For Occam, we can never grasp wisdom alone from goodness because it just is goodness.
But it's just a weird fact that when we talk, we're talking about wisdom alone.
Well, for Occam,
For Occam,
so when we talk, we're not talking about wisdom alone, right? The the referent is just God.
no, but connotative.
But yeah, but connotatively, it calls to mind different things,
Yeah,
and those enter into the truth conditions of propositions.
yeah.
Yeah,
Even though, like cognitively, we're focusing on the whole, but the
yeah,
connotations.
that's right.
Oh, that's a weird position. Okay,
That's awful.
It's kind of a nice view. Yes.
yeah.
Oh yeah. So thank you so much for that talk. I'm also interested in these issues, but coming from a very different sort of background. I sort of think to heavier philosophy language. So I was just thinking, the way I understood Aquinas, again, not the Aquinas expert, to be making a distinction between how we cognize the wisdom and goodness, etc., in God, is that there are the different ways that God's perfection can be imitated by creatures, for the different ways that God is sort of an exemplar cause of these perfections of creatures. So I was just wondering where that would come into.
Yes. Good. So the causation thing is not. I think that's not what he wants to say because he attacks Maimonides for saying this. That God is denominated good as the source of good things. And he says that's not what we want to say. God's good intrinsically, not merely as the source of good things. Now, the similitudes, I think that's close to some of the stuff I was saying. I think the picture is look, God has one perfection in himself. Okay? Period. And it's just the fullness of perfection. Now, because of the distinct similitudes that he has to creatures, we can start separating out one perfection from another, right? And start cognizing God partially and referring to him one aspect of his perfection without the others. And that's because of the weakness of our intellects and the fact that God can be the one simple perfection of God can be diversely imitated by our concepts and by creatures. Yeah. That's right. That's right.
First two, when we're talking about God, he's not.
Well, some I it can refer to like Deus just refers to God, but I think we can refer to the perfection of God's wisdom alone, and that's because we can't. That's because our cognition can be just of God's wisdom alone, because we can't fully cognize God's entire perfection at once. Yeah, Andreas.
Question about what these parts or aspects are.
Yeah.
And when I look at 1 and 2 here on your handout, 1 feels to me like either scotism or incoherence.
Okay.
Like it just there's a stench of contradiction to 1 somehow. 2 seems more promising, maybe. What do you think that these are equivalent or are these like different approaches? Maybe you could say something about are these different takes on the mystic view or
Yeah, these are me trying to make sense of what these parts or aspects are. What is this wisdom alone? And these are two different ways you could think about it. Um, I think that Aquinas' texts are underdetermined how we're supposed to think about it. And yeah, I'm part of the reason I gave both is because I wanted to hear what people thought about that. So I'll put you down as a vote for number 2. Yeah, thanks. Yeah,
So, Dominic, can I kind of piggyback on the earlier question? So, because the reference language is throwing me off a little bit.
Yeah.
So, is the claim this that on the Thomist view that our word sapientia, right, has a res significata in God that prescinds from like the res significata of like Almighty or something like that? Or is the view that wisdom and omnipotence supposit for different things in God?
Well, when you have abstract terms, the signification and the supposition, what's signified and what's supposited for are going to be the same thing. So,
I think not for the Modicea, which I take it Aquinas is one of.
we might have to talk
Okay, yeah,
offline
so-
about this because my understanding is that for abstract terms like animality or wisdom, what is signified and what is supposited for are the same thing. But we'll talk.
Yeah, let's talk.
Yeah. Andreas.
Another thought about my favorite number two.
Yeah.
So is the
Always not the best way to throw this thing.
is the view something like actually our concepts don't take objects as their trinomoi, that like that they made the right analysis of our concepts is that what they think are quabjects,
Yeah.
what they think are like objects. But you're
That's right. Yeah, I've played around with a couple different ways of doing this. So yeah, you could think what the object is a quabject, or you could think our cognition. There's a when we cognize God, we cognize it. There, so if we were to write that out in logic, there'd be a cooperator. So we cognize God. That would kind of function like an adverb. We cognize God, like wisdomly. Yeah, these are two other ways that you could model it. Again, straying a bit from, of course, from how Aquinas would put it. But yeah, I think that is one way to put it. I mean, it is striking on some of these quotes. There are multiple ways you could read them, but at some point, sometimes he does say the 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 c- the th- the thing cognized is the similitude. The intellect can what this is quote 7. That which the intellect conceives is a similitude, and a similitude of the thing existing outside the soul. So that looks kind of quabjecty, or again, maybe it's a cognition with a cooperator. It cognizes it similarly to this, right? Yeah. So if you like that suggestion too, that's another way I could go. Yeah. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Father Philip-Neri Reese. He's a Dominican friar and professor of philosophy at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, the Angelicum in Rome. His research focuses on metaphysics and its methodology, especially in Aquinas and the Thomistic tradition. The title of his talk today is How Convertible Are Aquinas' Transcendentals?
So, a few word framing words. So, first, this talk is an exercise in what we might think of as systematic Thomism. So, I am starting with things about which I have a very high degree of exegetical confidence, and then I'm working out entailments. So, what ought we as Thomistic metaphysicians now today say? I am extremely uncomfortable with how iconoclastic the conclusion is. So, if you guys can walk me back from the ledge, I would greatly appreciate it. So, I will try to speak only for 15 minutes. We'll see if I can succeed in that, and so as to open up a lot of time for Q&A, because I anticipate there will be some disgruntled Thomistic metaphysicians in the room. So, here's why I'm so unsettled. The conclusion that I have reached in this paper is that we Thomistic metaphysicians have to pick between three dissatisfying choices, and there are no other options. So either we have to say that transcendentality is metaphysically insignificant, in which case we get all of the canonical transcendentals from De Veritate 1:1 counting as transcendentals, and we do not need to impose any kind of restriction on divine omnipotence. So specifically, God's power to create. But we only get those two things, all of the canonical transcendentals counting as transcendentals, and no restriction on God's power to create. We only get those if we're willing to accept that transcendentality is metaphysically insignificant. That's not appealing. So here's another option, right? We can have metaphysically significant transcendentality and not impose any kind of restriction on God's power. But then we have to say that 3 of the canonical transcendentals from De Veritate 1:1 are not transcendentals. And they're bad ones, right? It's not just that we can get rid of like res and aliquid, right? We have to get rid of aliquid, we have to get rid of verum, and we have to get rid of bonum. That seems unappealing. So, what's our third option? Our third option is this. We can maintain that transcendentality is a metaphysically significant concept, and we can maintain all of the canonical transcendentals from De Veritate 1:1 at the cost of imposing what I take to be an extreme restriction on God's creative power. In particular, the restriction is this. If you want all of your transcendentals and you want transcendentality to be metaphysically significant, then you need to say that it is impossible for God to create a world that has exactly one non-intelligent, non-volitional being. You have to say that God can't do that. Not it's unfitting, not there are better ways to do it, right? We have to say, God cannot create a world with exactly one being that is non-intellectual and non-volitional. And that seems unappealing. So here's how we get to that trilemma. It's actually a very simple argument, and you've got it at the beginning of the handout. So premise 1, if transcendentality is to be metaphysically significant, then it has to mean what I've called the fourth sense of transcendentality. But, premise 2, if transcendentality means the fourth sense of transcendentality, then we have to either exclude some of the canonical transcendentals, namely aliquid verum and bonum, or we have to introduce a strong restriction on God's creative capacity. Therefore, if both of those premises are true, it follows that if transcendentality is to be metaphysically significant, then we must either exclude some of the canonical transcendentals or introduce a strong restriction on God's creative capacity. And that conditional is equivalent to the trilemma that I gave you earlier. So, what I do in the paper is there are just 2 main sections. And so section 1 proves the first premise and section 2 proves the second premise. My proof for the first premise, that if transcendentality is to be metaphysically significant, then it must be the fourth sense of transcendentality, is an inductive proof. So let's think about things that we could mean and that some people have meant in the past by transcendental. Here's the weakest and most sort of liberal one. So what we mean by transcendental is just a ratio, not limited to a single category. Right? So you might be inclined, like Scotus, to say that wisdom is transcendental because it's predicated both in the category of quality and of God, who is not in the category of quality, right? So its range of predication is beyond a single category of being. And I've given you a bunch of examples of things that will count as transcendentals, if that's what we mean by transcendentality. And the one that's especially interesting there is accident will count as transcendental there because it's predicable of 9 of the 10 categories of being. But if we don't like that, we can have a stronger sense of transcendentality, and many scholastics have. So we could think, second, that transcendentality means a ratio found in every category of being. And in that case, we have almost as many things counting as transcendentals, but accident no longer will count as a transcendental. But here's something that will: multiple. Here's another one: contingent. Right? So Contingent is a ratio found in every category. Multiple is a ratio found in every category. Potential is a ratio found in every category. And so could be transcendental in this second sense. But most Thomists want to be more restrictive than that. So we could mean 3, a ratio found in everything in every category. And that's going to get rid of all of those second members of disjunctive pairs, right? So that's going to get rid of potency. It's going to get rid of multiplicity. It's going to get rid of contingency. It's going to get rid of particularity, right? Nevertheless, we still have a pretty serious problem with this third sense of transcendentality, because this is going to allow to count as transcendentals things that I think we can helpfully refer to as contingent convertibles. So the third sense of transcendentality is a ratio found in everything in every category, right? So not just in every category, but in everything in every category. But contingent convertibles include things like this, right? So despite my narcissism, right, I think it's not metaphysically significant that everything in every category is somehow causally connected to me. That's true, right? So every actual being is actually causally connected to me. Every potential being is potentially causally connected to me. Every quantity is in some way causally connected to me. That does not reveal the nature of being, right? A metaphysician shouldn't be especially interested in that contingent convertible. Why? Well, because I am contingent, right? God didn't have to make me, right? And if God had chosen not to make me, then not everything in every category would be in some way causally connected to me. There are a number of others. I gave you not more than 10 to the 53rd kilograms. So we're told by people who seem to know that the total mass of the universe is 10 to the 53rd kilograms, which means that literally everything in every category of being is not more than that, right? So some things in some categories are not more than that because they don't have any mass, right? So the Archangel Gabriel, the time yesterday, the position upside down, have no mass, and so are not more than 10 to the 53rd kilograms, right? Some things have mass and just have a lower mass, right? But it should be obvious to us that there's no metaphysical weight, forgive the pun, to the fact that everything in every category is not more than 10 to the 53rd kilograms. So this ushers in the fourth sense of transcendental that most Thomists invoke, a ratio necessarily found in everything in every category. That, I think, now we're in the field, we're in the neighborhood of metaphysical significance, right? I think there's really good reason to think that something that is necessarily found in everything in every category is going to be somehow revelatory of the nature of being. And many Thomistic metaphysicians hold this view. Some, however, insist on an even stronger notion of transcendentality. This is transcendental, the sense 5, right? So a ratio necessarily found in everything, in every category, and grounded immediately in the ratio of being. So if you're somebody who stays up at night thinking about whether beauty is a transcendental, the difference between meaning 4 and meaning 5 is the locus of the debate, right? So people like Jan Ertzen argue that beauty is not a transcendental because it is immediately grounded in the ratio of goodness and also in the ratio of truth, and therefore doesn't count. For our purposes, we don't need to decide between meaning 4 and meaning 5. All we need to recognize is that the bare minimum moment where we've moved into the realm of metaphysical significance is at least meaning 4, right? Meanings 1, 2, and 3 all will count as transcendentals, contingent convertibles. Contingent convertibles are not metaphysically significant, so nothing is going to be, no transcendental 1, 2, or 3 is going to be metaphysically significant in virtue of being transcendental 1, 2, or 3. So if transcendentality is to be metaphysically significant, it has to be either transcendentality, the fourth sense, or some stronger sense. And in fact, like Joseph Owens has a transcendental 6, right? Where, because he wants to exclude res from the real transcendentals. But the reason why, right? Everybody gets worried about 4, 5, and then potentially stronger things is because I take it that everyone involved in talking about the transcendentals wants to be able to identify the transcendentals with the properties of being. And so when Thomists take themselves to be talking about the transcendentals as metaphysically significant and as revelatory of being, they do it precisely in the context of identifying transcendentality with the properties of being. So if I'm right, then I've just proven inductively, right, just by showing you, right, I've proven the first premise. To prove the second premise, I use a nasty, gigantic argument. So the argument, I'll just read through it very briefly. I'm not going to pause for a really long time on things, and then I'll just make some structural comments about the argument. Here's the argument. Every real analog is either a creature to God analog, so something that's analogically predicated of God and creatures, so vertical, or it's a creature to creature analog. It's horizontally analogous across ens commune. No creature to God analog is necessarily convertible with ens commune. Why? Well, because I just said that creature to God analogs are predicable of ens commune and God, right? So that just means by definition, they're not convertible with ens commune. But ens commune is the subject of metaphysics. From 2 and 3, you get no creature to God analog is necessarily convertible with the subject of metaphysics. But every property of the subject of a science is necessarily convertible with the subject of that science. Therefore, from 3 and 5, every property of the subject of metaphysics is necessarily convertible with ens commune. And from 4 and 5, you get no creature to God analog is a property of the subject of metaphysics. Now, there are creature to God analogs for aliquid verum and bonum, right? We can predicate something of God and of creatures. We can predicate something true of God and of creatures. We can predicate good of God and of creatures. And precisely according to that vertical that in De Veritate 2:11, Aquinas characterizes as excluding any kind of determinate distance between the analogates. So those analogs exist. But from 7 and 8, we get no creature to God analogs for aliquid verum and bonum are properties of the subject of metaphysics. Now, there are also creature to creature analogs for something verum and bonum. We can call a substance and an accident both something. We can call a substance and an accident both good. We can call a substance and an accident both true. Therefore, from 6 and 10, the creature to creature analogs for aliquid verum and bonum will be properties of the subject of metaphysics if and only if they are necessarily convertible with ens commune. Now, 12 and 13 are the big premises that we should care about. So 12 follows from Aquinas' characterization of aliquid verum and bonum in De Veritate 1:1, where he derives the transcendentals. So premise 12 says this: if God can create a world with just one non-intellectual, non-volitional being, then no creature-to-creature analog for aliquid verum and bonum is necessarily convertible with ens commune. Why? Because in that hypothetical scenario where God creates exactly one substance and it's non-intellectual, non-volitional, then in the sphere of ens commune, there is no other being in virtue of which the being would be something. There is no created intellect in virtue of which it would be creature to creature true. And there is no created will in virtue of which it would be creature to creature good. Yes, there's the divine intellect. Yes, there's the divine will. Yes, there's the divine being. And so the creature, that solitary, lonely creature, would be something true and good by a creature to God analog, but not by a creature to creature analog. And premise 12 is about creature to creature analogy. which again in De Veritate 211, Aquinas characterizes as not excluding determinate distance between the analogates. So these are different analogies of being, the horizontal and the vertical. Premise 13 is the key one. It just says, but God can create a world with just one non-intellectual, non-volitional being. Therefore, from 12 and 13, no creature-to-creature analogs for aliquid verum and bonum are necessarily convertible with ens commune. Therefore, no creature-to-creature analogs for aliquid verum and bonum are properties of the subject of metaphysics. And now you move in for the kill. So premise 1, premise 9, and premise 15 give you this. Every real analog is either creature to God or creature to creature. No creature to God analog for aliquid verum and bonum is a property of the subject of metaphysics. But no creature to creature analog for aliquid verum and bonum is a property of the subject of metaphysics. Therefore, no real analog for aliquid verum and bonum is a property of the subject of metaphysics. And if the transcendentals are supposed to be the properties of being the subject of metaphysics, then the conclusion of this argument is that aliquid verum and bonum are excluded from the transcendentals. Now, I take it that premises 1, 2, and we can talk about this if you want, but premises 1, 2, and 5 are both per se nota, at least to the wise, and uncontestably held by St. Thomas. Premises 3, 8, and 10 are not per se nota, but are uncontestably held by St. Thomas, which means if we want to deny a premise and in this argument and not deny something uncontestably held by St. Thomas, then we have to deny premise 13. We have to say, no, God could not create a world with just one non-intellectual, non-volitional being. And now we've got premise 2 of the overarching argument, right? You have, if transcendentality is going to mean properties of being, right? And so at least transcendental sub 4, then we have to pick between either accepting the conclusion and so excluding 3 of the canonical transcendentals, or denying premise 13, which means putting a pretty heavy restriction on God's creative capacity. And since both of those premises are true, then we have to accept the conclusion, which gives us the trilemma. Thanks.
And so what? Yeah, great.
Excellent.
And then
Yeah. So I want to ask you a little bit more about how you understand aliquid verum and bonum.
Mhm.
If they mean there is another thing,
Mhm.
and something is known, something is desired, then this has a lot of traction.
Mhm.
But if they mean there could be another thing,
Yeah, good.
all right. And I don't see why. So 13 says God can create a world with just one non-intellectual, non-volitional being. Well, maybe you need to talk more also about the identity conditions on worlds. I don't see why God could create such a world and then at least potentially add to that world another being which would solve all of your problems. So there's partly just a question of whether you understand these transcendentals to mean actually something's going on or just potentially, and also the identity.
Yeah, great. So, thank you. So in the paper, I consider 3 possible moves that we might make to try to like re-understand transcendentality and the transcendentals to kind of get out of it. So I mentioned one, which most people do, which is appeal to the divine, but that's not going to help because that's just going to establish a God to creature analog. So let me just read you the very second one, which is the one you anticipated. So can we avoid the conclusion by appealing to potentiality rather than actuality, such that the solitary creature in our imagined scenario would not actually be aliquid verum and bonum, but it would potentially be aliquid verum and bonum? No. First, because to grant that in such a scenario there would be a being that was not actually aliquid verum and bonum is simply to deny that aliquid verum and bonum are necessarily convertible with ens commune, right? So if there is an instance where they're not actually those things, then the second thing that you might want to do is a kind of like a counterfactual reinterpretation. So no, I'm not saying that they're just potentially. I'm saying something like this. No, what it is to be aliquid is to be, so a being would be aliquid just in case it would be other than some being if God created a multiplicity, right? And something will count as verum if it would be true, right? Like if God created a, or it would be knowable if God created an intellect, et cetera, et cetera. And I was really excited about this kind of counterfactual move until I realized that that exact move can be used to make necessary all of the contingent convertibles. So being somehow causally connected to me um, now becomes necessarily true of every being in every category because every being in every category is necessarily such that it would be causally connected to me if God created me. And so to make that move is just to put the transcendentals in precise parallel with things that we've already recognized are metaphysically insignificant.
Yeah. So then why not just move to Transcendental 5 and say, well, look, yeah, sure, it's true that necessarily everything is such that if von Philip-Neri existed, it would be logical. But that's not the extended the Lazio would be these other ones. Is that
Yeah, except if you move to anything stronger than 4, then you're going to exclude more things, not less things. And we've already seen that at the level of transcendental sub 4, you're already excluding aliquid verum and bonum, which I take it most people don't want to do. So you can, right? So transcendental sub 5, if you think that's what transcendental means, so it's necessarily, necessarily found in everything in every category and immediately grounded on being, that doesn't help you. That doesn't get you back aliquid verum and bonum.
yeah, it does if I do this kind of factual work. Because I'm saying, look, here's something which is necessarily found in every category, so grounded immediately upon the Lazio being. That the thing is, possibly intelligible to an intelligence, or possibly lovable by a created with, or possibly distinct from another created thing. Because those are
So good. So let me just this may be a deeply dissatisfying response, but I'm not aware of any Thomist metaphysician ever who has taken him or herself to mean that by transcendental. Not even like the most rigorous, like Owens and like McCart. So I'll think about it. That might be like a place in logical space where you could go. Um, but at minimum, it's still possible to say this, right? If that is a viable move, then everyone ever in the history of Thomistic metaphysics who has taken transcendentals to be metaphysically significant still falls prey to the trilemma, because that's not what they mean.
I was just
Yeah.
John St. Thomas,
Mhm.
and I think he takes this position because he says it wouldn't be enough for things to not be true
Mhm.
or not be good. It wouldn't. Yeah, it's not enough to imagine a scenario where there aren't creatures. You have to imagine a scenario where other creatures are impossible.
So yes. Yeah. So send me the text. I'd be interested to look at it. I would just, one little point is just to note that that's not actually the same thing as doing the counterfactual move. But we can talk about it more later. Jet.
So just a question on this dialectic. So I took Michael to be suggesting that you reinterpret sense or in a kind of factual way, what you said you were excited about it until you realized then it started, let's back in too many things.
Yeah.
And then Andreas was suggesting, yeah, but if you have the grounding thing, that might bring it back down to
Mhm.
a list of the things. But I was thinking if you were excited about the counterfactual one initially, then it does seem like a good strategy would be to find some further conditions that further reduced it.
Mhm. Yes. Right. Well, so I think there are basically two moves. So either we go where no Thomist has gone before, right? So new frontier, or we participate in kind of the tradition that has existed up until now, and then we pick one of the three options.
But then just so that maybe the question to that, suppose that you have not seen this problem as a counterfactual one and thought you're going with that. Wouldn't you already be going where no Thomistic gone?
Yes, and so I could. I mean, so a third response to that particular objection is just this looks like it's moving pretty far beyond the actual conversation of historical Thomists, and what Thomistic metaphysicians take themselves to be doing today. But I thought I didn't need to do that because I thought I had a better response. Yeah, but I could do that. One more. Yeah. Sam.
Maybe I'm just revealing myself not as wise, but on section 3, premise 2, I have difficulty seeing why that's the case. So no creature got analog is necessarily convertible with Mune. It does seem like with Baron and Bonum, you could tell some story where God's, to be true is to be measured by God's intellects, to be good is to be measured by God's will. Those seem necessarily convertible with Mune. I guess I just don't see why that would be problematic.
Sorry, give it to me again. So premise 2 says no creature to God analog, right? So a creature to God analog is by definition a ratio that is analogically predicable of God and creatures.
Yeah.
So that by definition can't be convertible with ens commune because God isn't in ens commune.
Also, the thing ex parte Dei.
What's it? Deus, right? So for Aquinas, right, ens commune is caused by God, right, and does not contain God, right? So this is like a really important thing that distinguishes his metaphysics from Scotus's metaphysics, Avicenna's metaphysics, and Suarez's metaphysics, right? That God does not fall under ens commune, rather he's the principle of ens commune. So any ratio that's predicable of God and ens commune is by definition predicable of more than ens commune, which means it's not convertible. Because what is convertibility? Just by definition, it's the biconditional. Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you all very much. Yeah.
Our last paper this morning is from Dr. Joshua Hochschild. Josh is a professor of philosophy at Mount St. Mary's University. He's the author of The Semantics of Analogy, Rereading Cajetan's De Nominum Analogia, and co-editor of Metaphysics Through Semantics, The Philosophical Recovery of the Medieval Mind, Essays in Honor of Jula Klima. The title of his paper today is Peace, a Case Study of Transcendentals, Divine Names, and Divine Naming.
I was going around. I'm sorry that I didn't have enough, but actually about half an hour ago, I just put online, if you go to tinyurl.com, peace handout, you'll get the handout. That's tinyurl.com, peace handout. I'm going to see if I can fit my computer up here. So, is that all right? In the introduction, I think you heard that the title of my talk changed since I initially proposed something. I thought I would do something a little more metaphysical and even kind of reflecting on Thomas's spiritual reflections on peace. This turned into something that actually fits better with the panel. This has become the Transcendentals panel. So I'm hoping to get some help. I feel out of my depth. I don't understand the scholarship on the Transcendentals. 25 plus years ago, when I started writing on analogy, I sort of explicitly set aside the question of the Transcendentals. So I'm dipping it's nothing against the Transcendentals. Some of my best friends are Transcendentalists, but I'm sort of wading into something and trying to make sense of it. So what I'm going to do today is make some observations about what Aquinas does with Pseudo-Dionysius's text on peace in chapter 11 of On the Divine Names. Then I'm going to review some recent scholarship that has engaged Aquinas on peace and questions raised by On the Divine Names. Then I'm going to object to some of those because, you can't have a talk about peace without stirring up a little turmoil. And I'm not going to resolve it, but I'm going to make some sort of proposals or hypotheses at the end. If you don't have the handout and can't see it online, there's one primary text on it, one secondary text, and then just the names of some of the other scholars. So you're not even missing all that much if you don't have it. So the first thing that I think people who would be new to Aquinas might be surprised, or new to the philosophical tradition might be surprised,
is how obviously it is that peace is a positive presence in Dionysius and in Aquinas. I mean, that's surprising because we might be inclined to think of peace as a negation or a privation, right? Conflict, war, discord, those seem to be the things that we notice, and then we want them to go away. But peace is the being, and the absence of peace is the privation. Um, it's so much real that Dionysius and Aquinas describe it as causal and generative, right? It's an efficient cause, it's a final cause, it's an exemplar cause, but it's specifically generative. And the language reminds me of Diotima's speech about love and beauty in the Symposium, that it's the peace seeks a kind of productive unity. That's a major theme of Dionysius in the Divine Names, and certainly Aquinas in his exposition of it. The second thing to note about what Dionysius does and Aquinas following him is that peace extends to all beings. The reflection starts with what we might call the version of peace most known to us, which I take to be the political sense of peace as concord among human beings, among embodied rational agents. But then it extends actually kind of in three directions. It extends inward to concord within the rational being, right? So you can have a kind of interior peace. It extends up to other rational beings, angels and including God. So God is the exemplar of peace. And it extends down to non-rational beings that have a kind of peace. The term that's used is by connaturality, but that seems to be saying it's not just a metaphor that non-rational things can be at peace. They really are at peace in the way appropriate for the kind of beings that they are. They're not rational beings, but they're real, and so they have a share and participation in peace. So the point here is that peace starts maybe with what we would think of as the political center, but then it extends inward, up, and down. In that extension of the notion of peace, right, reflection on the ratio of peace keeps developing and changing. Right? So there are a lot of different words that are used to describe what is included in peace. Some of them emphasize unity and union, and Dionysius and Aquinas seem to be playing with different ways to assert union and unity, and whether those ways imply that there was a diversity that had to be resolved. There are words that describe concord or agreement, especially with a connotation of rational creatures coming to agreement, but then extending that to something that doesn't necessarily imply rational agreement, like rest or tranquility. So a lot of the words that we associate with peace, just naturally in English, come out as expounding the ratio of peace for Dionysius and for St. Thomas. And the fourth thing that I want to note about the reflections there is that it's kind of hard to avoid that peace ends up sounding like a transcendental in chapter 11 of the Divine Names and Aquinas' commentary on it. And the quote, I won't read the whole thing, but the quotation from Francis McMahon on the handout, this is an article from 1939, an early issue of the Thomist, I think spells this out really well, that following Dionysius and St. Thomas there, peace is convertible with being. Anything that is, insofar as it is participating in peace and can be said to be at peace. I'm not reading either the Aquinas or the McMahon quotations for the sake of time, but that's why I provided them for you. So now, some recent scholarship on peace in Aquinas. Gregory Reichberg published in 2020 something that he probably wrote about 5 years earlier for a lecture, as best I can tell. An essay about peace in Aquinas, which raises the question of whether peace is said properly of God. And Reichberg, in that essay, finds philosophical reasons to say that peace is not properly said of God, that it's only said relationally, not absolutely, but in terms of of God's relation to creatures. So here's a short quotation from Reichberg. He says, God's being is such that no obstacles can stand in the way of his fulfillment. He's been emphasizing divine simplicity. Hence, none need be removed, nor is there any diversity in God's nature that can be brought into unity. He is purely and simply one, and for this reason, it would seem that peace can be said of his being, not formally, but only in relation to creatures. Reichberg is kind of tentative about that. He thinks that that's kind of a philosophical conclusion, and he's willing to allow that there might be theological, that is, revealed theological reasons to think that peace is properly said of God, but only insofar as there is division or diversity in God, as revealed in the doctrine of the Trinity. John Meinert, in 2019, so a year before Reichberg's essay was published, but Reichberg might not have known the essay since he wrote his lecture earlier, apparently independently, raises the question of whether peace is a transcendental. He argues that it is a transcendental of the good, unfolding the desirability of the goodness, right? Sort of spelling out precisely what it is that's being desired in the desirability of goodness. On the question of whether peace is said properly of God, he comes to the similar conclusion as Reichberg, that God's absolute unity precludes peace from being a proper divine name, except in light of the Trinity. So here's a quotation from Meinert in 2019. Without revelation of the Trinity, one could not say there is distinction or multitude in God, both of which are required to properly predicate the positive ratio of peace. Now, Meinert published a book this year on peace, and he comes back to this question, and it's developed a little bit. He continues to argue that peace is a transcendental of the good, and he again addresses the question of how peace is a divine name. And now, here, cognizant of and somewhat as an alternative to Reichberg's suggestion, he defends the view that peace, like unity, can be predicated affirmatively, absolutely, and properly of God. That's as opposed to negatively, affirmatively, but relatively, or affirmatively, absolutely, but metaphorically. But he argues Aquinas can only do this because of a subtle shift in his articulation of the ratio of peace from including union and order, which on his interpretation implies multitude or distinction, to including only unity. So it's not union or ordering, but simply unity, that's it. Meinert argues that in doing so, Aquinas is speaking philosophically, emphasizing divine simplicity, and that without revelation of the Trinity, one could not say that there is distinction or alterity in God, both of which are required, I'm quoting him again, to properly predicate the positive ratio of peace in the strictest sense of implying union and order. So the bottom line between both Reichberg and Meinert is that peace may be a transcendental, but it doesn't really stand on its own. It's a transcendental of the good, in the sense that it is sort of reducible to the good, or it can only be understood as unfolding something that's already contained in the good. And that even as such, even as kind of a transcendental, in the way that some people argue about beauty, right? And that's a part of the background of this argument. Even as such, it is only properly known as applying to God by revelation, not by reason. They seem to be in agreement about that. So now, briefly, my objections to that position. Both Reichberg and Meinert seem to look first for a ratio of peace, and then consider whether that ratio is predicable of God. Meinert, in both his book and his paper, but it's even more clear in his book, considers the question of the transcendentality of peace before the question of it being a divine name, and the question of the transcendentality of peace rests on the question of what is the ratio of peace. That makes sense if you think of it on its own, but the movement of Dionysius's and Aquinas's reflections in chapter 11 and the exposition seems to go in the other direction. They both trust that God must be an exemplar of peace. Whatever peace turns out to be, God must have it preeminently. And then they look for a ratio that would allow them to apply it coherently both to God and creatures. It's just totally different direction. Second objection. For Dionysius and Aquinas, this movement, their movement from divine name to considering transcendentality instead of the other way, is clearly a philosophical movement. God is peace, and peace extends to all creation, and that can be known by natural reason. It's specifically discovered through natural theology. The divine names Aquinas considers, although it brings in the light of Christian faith, the main arguments are on unfolding what can be known about God by natural reason. And peace is one of the divine names. The third objection is that if peace needs to be subsumed under one of the more common transcendentals, it's not obvious to me why it has to be subsumed under goodness. The quotation that I have on the handout from McMahon emphasizes how easily it would be to subsume it under unity. And actually, the reasoning of Meinert, I think, better supports subsuming it under unity rather than goodness. But for that matter, I think it could be subsumed under truth, because it is wisdom that orders. And when Aquinas in the Summa talks about peace, one of the places he talks about it is under the virtue of wisdom. And I think it could be subsumed directly under being, insofar as rest or remaining what it is or fully fulfilling its nature as the kind of thing it is, doesn't have to come under good or unity. That could just be directly. Anyway, this practice of looking for a a, a place for the transcendental under another transcendental, it doesn't obviously lead to goodness. I mean, peace is desirable, so goodness makes sense, but not at the exclusion of the others. So, my conclusion is really sort of pointing out some problems or raising some questions. But even before that, I will say that I think what I'm noticing in chapter 11 of the Divine Names confirms Brian Carl's recent argument about how we should understand the relationship between the transcendentals and the divine names. So he spells out in great detail how he thinks it's a mistaken move to assume that you can only get to divine names after you straighten out the transcendentals and then know how to move from transcendentals to divine names. He finds that it actually often works in the other direction. A proposal, I think it's important to make a distinction when we're talking about divine naming in Aquinas between, we need to make a distinction between thinking of divine names, right, as describing God, that's an exercise of natural theology, from thinking about divine naming as more of a semantic question that comes up, say, in question 13 of the Summa, right? So you actually use divine names and talk about divine names and unpack what the divine names mean long before you talk about how the divine names do that for you, right? And I don't always find that distinction carefully made. Another proposal, and well, it seems to me that we need to distinguish between different senses that we talk about the ratio of a concept. The ratio could be the concept itself, right? And then you can be using it before you have an articulation of what it means, right? We start talking about peace before we've thought about how to define it, right? But the ratio can also, in these conversations, it often seems to mean not what concept do you have in your head, but how would you spell that out in terms of other concepts? And it's fine to use ratio in both of those cases, but it seems to me we just need to do a better job of keeping straight whether we're talking about a concept that we can use without even knowing how it's going to be defined, and an articulation of a ratio. And this is especially important to keep in mind when talking about the transcendentals, because presumably the transcendentals technically don't even have definitions. So they can be spelled out or articulated in terms of other concepts that are useful to us, but we're not defining them. And that suggests that also maybe transcendentals don't have to have one definitive articulation, that it's okay if in different contexts of talking about the transcendentals, we spell it out in different ways. This brings me finally to a couple of the things that continue to bother me about the transcendentals, and Father Philip-Neri can confirm that I did come up with this independently, although it confirms what his talk was about. I don't think it makes sense to talk about transcendental properties of being. The transcendentals are convertible with being. It's not like being is there and then we have to. I don't know where that started. I don't know who talked about. Father Philip-Neri can tell us who started that. I don't know where it started, but I don't think it makes sense to talk. SCOTUS's fault again. So I don't think it makes sense to talk about transcendental properties of being. I don't understand why there has to be a normative list of transcendentals. Maybe there does, but I don't understand why. I know why some of them like get talked about more than others. It seems to me mostly for anthropological reasons, right? So we in ourselves distinguish between intellect and will. So after being, we add truth and goodness. But it seems to me that if there's any intelligible way to describe being, then it can be a transcendental, and I don't know why it has to be then we have to argue over whether it's canonical or not, or whether there's a final number. And if there is a normative list or not, it doesn't seem to me that new transcendentals that we consider have to always be subsumed under one or another, right? As I was describing for peace, it seems to me that it can be described in any under any of the more common transcendentals. The last thing I'll just propose as a kind of reflection is that it seems to me that a lot of what Dionysius does with peace, and Aquinas seems to draw out of him, connects in very uncanny ways with what Aristotle does with the notion of actuality. And if you remember in the Metaphysics, Aristotle has two words for actuality in Greek. One of them is energeia, one of them is entelecheia. And there's a very awkward but philosophically interesting translation of Aristotle's use of those terms by Joseph Sachs. And Joseph Sachs translates energeia as being at work. That's the ergon in it. But he translates entelecheia as being at work remaining itself, active in such a way, not that it's changing, but that it is keeping itself to remain. Right? That sounds a lot like peace. And it seems to me that some of the transcendentals that we discover, they might not be like obvious everyday terms and things first known to us, but once we reflect on them, they might actually reveal something deeper about the divine nature and about all creatures that would even suggest that they should be more privileged than the common ones of, say, being, truth, goodness. So thank you very much. We have 10 minutes. 10 minutes, good.
Well, then, every one of our speakers hit 20 minutes on the mark. I don't know that it's ever happened. So, congratulations.
Josh. Oh, Andres, sorry. One thought about the canonical list.
Yeah.
I think I kind of share your dissatisfaction with the whole session with what canonical is. But one reason that you might have for thinking that it's important is there's this text in the De Potentia in Aquinas where he's kind of worked out very carefully how you get the idea of unity, and he kind of because there's this worry about a conceptual circle there, and he kind of does some very careful work to explain. Oh no, first you say you have being, and then you negate it. So then you can say this being is not that being. So then you have distinction, then you have multiplicity, and you whatever.
The denial.
Complicated story, right? But the point is that one of the things that the transcendentals are supposed to be is these like interesting ways of explicating the meaning of being. But the other thing that they're supposed to be is they're supposed to be kind of epistemically first, right? That these are the first conceptions of your mind. These are the ultimate items of resolution. And then you don't want a kind of, if you have a multitude without any kind of hierarchy or order to them, then that's kind of chaotic. So you want to have some kind of hierarchical order of these first conceptions so that you can kind of explore them in order. So these are the kinds of thoughts I think that people get worried about where exactly you put something like peace, because you want to have an order of these first conceptions.
That makes perfect sense to me. And if we just want to say, look, the canonical list is those that are convertible with being that Aristotle talked about in the Metaphysics, I'm fine with that, right? We get unity, we get truth, we get goodness. Fine. But then when we discover that there's something else that's also convertible with being, and that maybe outside of the scope of metaphysics, strictly speaking, as a science, or not outside of it, I don't know. If it seems to inform our understanding of creatures and of God, and it is convertible with being, like, I don't know why we have to say, yeah, it's not first known to us; it's discovered. There might be transcendentals that we just start with as sort of basic, but then we could discover others. Why don't they also deserve to be considered as transcendental? We can have different lists, but there should be lists of transcendental.
Can I just jump in on this? Yeah, I published something about 20 years ago, Los Homos, which argues something very much like this. There are lists of the transcendentals that we can find. Probably the most canonical one is De Veritate 1:1, right? But in De Veritate 1:1, what Aquinas is doing is trying to define truth. And transcendentals that he enumerates there, it's sort of a roadmap to getting to truth. And it's a nice systematization of the transcendentals, but it's not meant to be a systematization of the transcendentals, right? And I think that in the later tradition,
it's become that, and there's a rigidity there, which is I don't think is an Aquinas, and I think it's good to undo that rigidity. That sounds great.
Please. Thank you very much. Just a question of clarification because I didn't read the article of the divine names and just the elephants, and I'm not sure I got exactly the point. If you can explain it again.
Well, he does a lot more than what I'm summarizing, and it's a long article. But I think for me the most useful point, and it is a central point, is that it is common for Thomists to approach divine names through the question of transcendentals, and this is confirmed for me by exactly what Meinert and Reichberg were doing. But that there's good reason to think that that's not how we should understand the relationship. You don't have there. I don't think Brian says this, but I would say there's something kind of Cartesian about that. Like we got to get our concepts straight, and then we can do philosophy with it, or something like that. Um, he finds many cases where the divine names discussion of divine naming can take place independently of or before the discussion of the transcendentality of the names that are being used.
Okay, thanks.
I'm thinking about what Dionysius is taking, if anything, from Proclus that corresponds to peace in his language, and seeing the language of the fecundity,
Yes.
and the overflow. I'm wondering if peace might really be something with the effect of self-sufficiency that comes from something that, especially in the triad of remain, percet, exitus, and meditus, remain, manas,
Yeah.
praelos epistrophe, the reality of like being a high enough type of being. In this case, we're talking about the highest ultimately, the divine peace that overflows, such that there's a fecundity that overflows.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about what might be the heritage of that.
It's a great question. I would love to explore that more. It's obviously a rich resource for Christian theologians who then use it to describe not just how God's peace overflows, but even how human peace can overflow. And so the peaceful person is also a peacemaker, right? And actually, the second reading yesterday from James, I'm not gonna remember it exactly, but it lists things that follow from each other, and peace is at the beginning of the list, and how things flow from peace. Right? So the one thing that I'm sympathetic to in or a thing that I'm sympathetic to in Reichberg and Meinert's reflections, that it is very clear that peace helps articulate certain revealed Christian truths, right? That Christ brings peace, and it makes sense that peace would be appropriated to one or another of the persons of the Trinity, right? The dove as the Holy Spirit is a symbol of peace, but also Christ brings peace. God as governor overseeing the universe, it's ultimately his peace, the Father. So it's not only appropriated to one, but it can be appropriated to each of the three persons of the Trinity, and it describes something about what a state of healthy human affairs is. It's peaceful, and one of the signs of its peacefulness is that it spreads peace to others. But that's all Christian theological, and it's all rooted in a Neoplatonic idea that of the fecundity of peace arrived at without Christian revelation. I just think that's fascinating.
Agree.
Yeah. Can you explain to me what is the problem of the expression transcendental properties of being? And my understanding, being is the first transcendental, the basic transcendental, and other transcendental are then, in that case, aspects or different ways in which being can be expressed. So the link that being is linked.
Be I have no problem with being central. It's the word properties. Why not just say transcendentals of being? Like what work is the word properties doing if you add we can talk about transcendentals of being or the transcendental properties of being.
Property is not the most important thing. You can replace it with aspect or something like that.
That reduces it somewhat to me, but it makes it sound as if it's too easy to forget that what we're talking about is convertibility. That when you're talking about one, you're always talking about the other. Anytime you're talking about being, you're talking about goodness. Anytime you're talking about goodness, you're talking about being. They are convertible with each other. to use properties or attributes makes it sound like you've got a core thing and then other stuff that attach. I'm exaggerating the imagination behind it, but especially the word property, especially in Anglo-American philosophy, suggests to me all kinds of baggage that I would like to get away from. And
First on being, and other transcendentals are after being. This
and that's fine, and we probably don't really disagree about what we're talking about. But I do have this strong opinion about which language is more appropriate, and I was happy to. I didn't know this, but did I hear you say last night that Aquinas never says transcendental properties of being?
So there are things that Aquinas in his corpus calls per se accidentia entis, per se passionis entis, and propria entis. They're never the canonical transcendentals of De Veritate 1:1, and they're always almost always disjunctive pairs. So there are a few other things.
yeah.
One is one of the fascia. No, it's the only time it's only one and many. And there's one place where he calls true and false differentia entis, which actually isn't the same thing as passionis entis, but yeah.
Got it. You know that one. I don't know. We actually just hit our time. If there's one more question, yeah, there's one more in the back.
Yeah, so that was a
Jump in.
beautiful and a peaceful talk, I have to say. It's like literally was just meant something to me. But I didn't hear Augustine and all this, and I just kept thinking, my goodness, I mean, Renator of peace, and tranquilitas ordinis, and the whole study is written on this, and so I was wondering whether Augustine plays into Thomas's understanding peace as much as Dionysius. That's the kind of the first question. But what I thought most beautiful about your talk was how you show, I think, and this is a kind of something for reflection, how peace goes all the way up and all the way down, and in the sense that there is really no immanent frame. It's not that the world is just a kind of a closed system of things in a state of some state of actuality, but the entelechis of things. If we read them the way you do, that the end of things, which is to say the peace of all things, is given in all things, and so God, as the end of all things, is actually in all things. So I thought you showed both, that peace goes all the way up, and in some ways that the tranquility of order is at the bottom of everything. The God of order is in all things, and that's somehow key to Augustine too.
I agree, and I only alluded to Augustine by using words like tranquility and order. Aquinas is obviously aware of that. I didn't talk about him mainly because he's not central to the text from the divine names. But when Aquinas and Meinert's book is excellent on this, on the different sources of the notion of peace for Aquinas. When Aquinas is theorizing peace, he's drawing on Pseudo Dionysius, which has the theological frame. He draws on Augustine, who starts with the political, right? Tranquility of order conceived of as something important for social beings, but Augustine also extends it beyond that. He's drawing some on the early fathers and the spiritual tradition of interior peace, and of course he's drawing on scripture. So he's always looking for ways to not just interpret scripture through those other three sources, but use scripture to shed light on the notion of peace itself. Yeah, thank you very much.
We've ended our time. Thanks, Justin.